Something is already happening. You haven't spoken yet. You may not have even looked up, but something in the room has changed. Not the furniture, not the light, and your body has already begun its calculation. There's a faint shift in your shoulders you didn't authorize. A small adjustment in your breathing. Not a decision, just a fact about you that arrived before you did. The nervous system is not polite about this. It doesn't wait. Within milliseconds of detecting another person's presence, their movement, their voice frequency, the particular rhythm of how they occupy space, your autonomic nervous system has already begun sorting. Not consciously, not with language. It runs something older than language, a biological inheritance so deep it predates the part of you that can form the thought there is someone here. By the time that thought arrives, the work is mostly done, and here's the part that's easy to miss. This is not threat detection. Not only that, it's identity calibration. Your nervous system is not just deciding whether this person is dangerous. It's deciding, with extraordinary speed and almost no input from you, which version of you is appropriate for this moment. You've probably felt this. Walking into a room where someone you admire is standing. Something tightens, reorganizes. You become slightly more careful with your words. Your posture changes. Your laugh comes out a different pitch. None of this feels performed exactly. It just feels like you, a particular you, the one that belongs in this kind of room with this kind of person. But something in you knows, if you stay very still, that this isn't the only you there is. The social brain, and there really is such a thing, a distributed network of regions that does almost nothing but track, simulate and respond to other people, begins its work somewhere in the superior temporal sulcus. This fold of cortex responds to biological motion, not just faces, not just voices, the specific, irregular way a living body moves through space. The giveaway tremor of a nervous hand. The micro pause before someone speaks when they're uncertain. Your brain reads all of this, constantly, automatically, and begins adjusting your output before your conscious self has been consulted. There is something almost unsettling about that. The consulting happens last. Researchers studying behavioral mimicry have found that people begin mirroring the posture, the gesture patterns, the respiratory rate of those around them within the first seconds of interaction. Not all people equally, not in all situations, but as a baseline biological tendency, the synchronization begins almost immediately, and it runs in both directions. Your body pulling toward the other person's rhythm while theirs, without knowing it, begins pulling toward yours. What this means, slowly it's worth sitting with, is that your self is partly a social organ, not a metaphor, an actual, biological, continuously updated structure that takes its shape, at least in part, from whoever is near. The philosopher's question of whether there is a real self underneath all the adaptation, your body has a different answer than philosophy does, or maybe not an answer, more like a shrug, a biological shrug. The prefrontal cortex, which handles so much of what we call executive identity, doesn't particularly distinguish between the self that exists alone and the self that exists in relation. It manages both. It shifts between them with a casualness that would be troubling to examine too directly. So you let it go. You're not performing exactly, you're not lying. The version of you that exists right now reading this is real. It has always been real. It is built from the same neural architecture, the same hormonal history, the same collection of experiences that make you distinctly you. But it is also, and this is the thing, slightly different from the you that existed an hour ago in a different room with different people. Not in a dramatic way, more like a key change, same song, slightly different register. The self that walks into a room is already arriving changed. You didn't decide this, you inherited it. Somewhere in the long chain of biology that produced your particular nervous system, social responsiveness was selected for so aggressively, so persistently, that it now runs like a background process, the kind you'd never find by looking, but that you can feel in the faint difference between who you are when you're alone and who you are when you hear someone's key turn in the door down the hall. That difference isn't a problem, isn't a sign that you don't know who you are. It's a sign that your biology is working exactly as it was built to work, adjusting, reading, responding, doing all of this before you've had the chance to overthink it, which is perhaps the only kindness your nervous system regularly extends to you. The room is quiet now. Whatever calculation your body made when you began reading this, whatever micro-adjustment it ran in the first seconds, whatever self it quietly assembled for the purposes of being alone with the voice in the dark, that version of you is the one settling in now, breathing at its own pace, releasing what it held together in the presence of others. There is a region of the brain that becomes more active in the absence of external demands. The default mode network, it's called, though the name is clinical and the experience of it is anything but. It hums to life when the social performance quiets, when there's no one to calibrate for. It is involved in self-referential thinking, in memory, in a kind of quiet internal narrative that only gets airtime when the outer one is paused. Right now it has the room to itself, and somewhere underneath all the shifting, underneath the versions of you that appear and adjust and calibrate and respond, something steady persists, not unchanging, but persistent. A biological signature that remains legible across all the adaptations. The question of what exactly that is, the neuroscience does not yet answer cleanly, which is, for tonight, enough. You probably don't notice when it starts. That's the thing about mimicry, not the conscious kind, the deliberate flattery of copying someone's phrase or borrowing their enthusiasm, but the biological kind, the older kind, the one that runs so far beneath intention that calling it behavior almost feels inaccurate. It's closer to weather, something that happens in you the way pressure changes happen in a room before a storm arrives. Not visible, not chosen, just real. Watch two people who know each other well sitting together, and you'll eventually see it. One leans back, the other follows within seconds. One slows their speech, and the other's cadence softens to match. Not always, not perfectly, but persistently enough that researchers began measuring it, began mapping the lag between one person's gesture and another's mirror of it, and found the window was often under 4 seconds, sometimes under 2, a delay so short the person doing the mirroring had no conscious access to it. Your body does this. Right now, if someone is nearby, it is almost certainly doing some version of this. But here is the part that tends to get left out of the easy explanation. The mimicry doesn't stop at the surface. It doesn't stay in the muscles, in the tilt of the head or the crossing of the arms. It goes inward. The facial feedback hypothesis, contested for years, revised, partially restored, points at something real even in its complicated form. That the physical configuration of your face and body feeds back into your emotional state. Not completely, not mechanically, but enough that when your face does what another face is doing, something in your internal state begins, quietly to follow. You lean towards someone who is grieving and hold their posture, and something in you, not sympathy exactly, something more cellular than sympathy, begins to approximate what they are carrying. You sit near someone whose body is tight with anxiety, whose jaw holds a particular tension, and your own jaw may find that same tension without your permission. This is not imagination. It is physiology running a program that was never meant to be interrupted by self-awareness. The neurons involved here, and the mirror neuron system, whatever its full story turns out to be, is only part of it, are doing something that might be thought of as resonance, though I tend to think that word is used too loosely and too often. What's more accurate and stranger is that your brain is running a simulation, an internal model of the other person's state, constructed from observation, continuously updated and experienced, faintly usually, as a sensation in your own body, not their sensation, a copy, a biological draft of what it might feel like to be them. This is what the chameleon effect actually changes, not just your posture, not just your expression, it shifts through these cascading feedback loops, the emotional weather inside you. The version of you that emerges from a long evening with someone who moves slowly and speaks in low registers is measurably different in its cortisol profile, its heart rate variability, its baseline arousal from the version that spent the same evening with someone kinetic and loud. Same person, different room, different body, almost. There is a study, quiet, easy to miss in the literature, in which participants who were instructed to mimic their interaction partners reported liking them more afterward. Not because the mimicry was strategic, because the internal resonance it produced softened something, created a biological proximity that the social brain interpreted, without being asked, as familiarity, as something worth returning to. Your personality then, at least the emotional layer of it, is not sealed. It breathes. It takes in the biological atmosphere of whoever is nearby and adjusts its own chemistry accordingly. This happens in long relationships slowly, over months and years. It happens in brief encounters more quickly than feels comfortable to consider. The extended version of this is what long marriages do to nervous systems. What years inside a particular family's emotional climate deposit into a person's baseline. The chameleon effect is not an afternoon phenomenon. Run it across a decade and you begin to see how profoundly the people we stay near become part of the biology we carry when they're gone. That's not poetic license. That is how nervous systems actually work. What remains underneath all of it is harder to locate. Something does remain. The studies on temperament across lifespan are clear enough about that. The biological flaw of personality that mimicry adjusts but does not replace. But I am not sure we fully understand where the influence ends and the self begins. The line biologically is not clean. The tidal quality of it is what strikes me most, if I'm being honest about it. In, out. Another person's nervous system brushing against yours, leaving something behind. Your own system pulling back, carrying a small residue of their emotional frequency. Over and over, across every room you've ever been in. You are right now the accumulated remainder of all of that. The body settles when it's understood. Not because understanding changes anything structural, it doesn't, not tonight, but because there is something in naming a process that allows the nervous system to stop bracing against it. The mimicry will happen tomorrow. The adjustment will run, and somewhere in that automatic, unasked-for resonance will be a version of you that is genuinely present with another person in a way no deliberate effort could manufacture. That version is also you. It is also, in its way, quite old. There is a tension your body carries that you did not choose, not metaphorical tension. Actual muscular holding, actual shifts in autonomic tone, the kind that live in the shoulders, in the way the throat closes slightly around certain kinds of silence. You probably know the feeling without having named it. The particular alertness that arrives when someone nearby is unpredictable. The loosening that happens when a voice enters a room and something in you before thought recognizes it as safe. These responses were not learned recently. The attachment system, and it is a system, distributed, stubborn, operating on circuitry that was largely established before language, begins its calibration in the earliest months of life, not years, months. The nervous system of an infant is already tracking contingency, whether distress produces comfort, whether proximity produces regulation, whether the world of other people is, at its baseline, a place of reliable warmth or managed unpredictability. What gets laid down in those early patterns is not exactly memory. It is closer to expectation, biological expectation, encoded not in narrative but in reflex, in how quickly your heart rate climbs when someone withdraws, in how long it takes your breathing to slow after conflict, in the particular muscular shape your body makes when you feel unseen. You carry all of this into every room you enter. John Bowlby called them internal working models, mental representations of how attachment figures behave, of what can be expected from closeness, of whether the self is worthy of being stayed with. The term is decades old now, and the neuroscience behind it has grown considerably more textured. What the imaging studies show is that these models are not merely cognitive, they are embodied. They live in the insula, in the anterior cingulate, in the vagal pathways that regulate social engagement. They are, in the most literal sense, written into how your nervous system handles the proximity of other people. This is why a stranger with a particular way of going quiet can produce in you a feeling with no obvious source, not a memory, something earlier than memory, a biological echo of a pattern your nervous system learned to anticipate before you had words for anticipation. The stranger isn't that person. Your body knows this technically. But the resemblance, in timing, in tone, in some quality of presence that doesn't have a clean name, is enough to activate an old response. The warmth that arrives unexpectedly, the guardedness, the inexplicable ease. This is not projection in the loose sense, it is biological priming. The nervous system categorizes relational experience and uses those categories to generate predictions, fast, mostly unconscious, mostly accurate enough that they go unchallenged. When a new person triggers an old category, the prediction runs before the evidence has been fully examined. You've probably felt the reverse of this too. Someone who by every external measure should feel safe, kind, consistent, generous, and yet something in your body holds, doesn't fully release, stays slightly braced. This is not irrational. It is the attachment system doing what it was built to do. Compare incoming data against accumulated relational history and produce a verdict faster than conscious reasoning can intervene. The verdict isn't always right, but it is always, in its own way, sincere. What the research on attachment across adulthood suggests, and this is the part I find most worth sitting with, is that early patterns are not deterministic. They are influential, the distinction matters. A person who developed what researchers call an anxious attachment style characterized by hypervigilance to signs of abandonment, elevated cortisol in ambiguous social situations, difficulty with the return to baseline after relational disruption, that person's nervous system is running a particular program. But programs in nervous systems are not fixed. They are weighted, and weights can shift slowly through sustained experience of something different. New relationships, if they persist and remain consistent, begin to update the prediction model. Not overnight, not without resistance. The old expectation will surface, will test the new pattern, will look for the familiar outcome. When the familiar outcome doesn't arrive, when the person stays, when the rupture is repaired, when the silence turns out to be neutral rather than threatening, something in the attachment system over time recalibrates. The body learns again. This takes longer than anyone wants it to. What I find harder to articulate, and the neuroscience is still working on this too, honestly, is how much of our response to people we love right now is a response to people who are no longer here. The imprinting runs deep. The biological traces of early caregiving don't fade cleanly with time or distance. They persist in the vagal tone, in the immune profile, in the particular quality of longing that arrives when someone we love is temporarily gone. You are, in some cellular sense, still in relationship with people you haven't seen in years. This isn't sentimental. It's a structural fact about how attachment memory is stored, not in episodic recall, not primarily, but in procedural memory, in the implicit body knowledge of how to be near another person. That knowledge was written by specific people. It remains regardless of where those people are now. The room you're in tonight holds none of them, and yet something in the way your body settles, or doesn't, carries the shape of what they left behind. The particular threshold at which you feel comfortable being known. The residual alertness that lives just beneath rest. The warmth that arrives slightly unexpectedly when a voice in the dark sounds like it has nowhere else to be. All of it is old, all of it still is yours. Somewhere early, a rank was settled on. Not announced, not negotiated. It assembled itself across hundreds of small interactions. Who spoke first, who waited, who moved aside in a doorway without thinking about it, who held eye contact a beat longer than felt comfortable. These moments were not significant individually. Accumulated, they produced something that functioned like a position. Your nervous system knows what that position is. It has always known. The research on social hierarchy in humans borrows heavily from animal models. Dominant structures in primates, pecking orders, the physiological consequences of rank, and the borrowing is not metaphorical. Human nervous systems respond to social status with the same hormonal architecture that governs status in other species. Cortisol rises in situations of status threat. Testosterone shifts around competition and its outcomes. Serotonin availability in certain neural pathways correlates across species with perceived social position. This is not a personality feature. It is a biological condition. The brain regions involved, the amygdala reading threat, the anterior cingulate monitoring social pain, the prefrontal cortex managing behavioral output, are continuously calculating something like standing, not consciously, not in language, in the faster currency of physiological state, who is safe to challenge, who requires deference, where in this particular room the self belongs. And here is what makes this strange to sit with. The rank your nervous system settled into, largely before adolescence, largely through repetition rather than choice, shape the behavioral repertoire you now experience as personality, the ease or difficulty of speaking first, the threshold at which disagreement feels permissible, the particular quality of the pause before you offer an opinion in a room full of people you don't know. These feel like traits. They feel intrinsic. They are at least partly postures. Biological postures held long enough to become invisible. A role was assembled from available material, the family structure, the classroom dynamics, the particular social ecology of early life, and the nervous system built its predictions around it, built its default outputs around it. What feels now like introversion or confidence, or the instinct to manage rather than lead, or the reflex to lead before thinking? Much of this has roots in a rank negotiation that concluded decades ago. The brain defends its settled position. This is not cynical, it is efficient. Status threat, the experience of being challenged, undermined, outperformed in a domain that feels identity adjacent, activates overlapping neural circuitry with physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes the unpleasantness of both, does not cleanly distinguish between a bruised shin and a bruised standing. The distress is real. The defense that follows is automatic. This is why certain conversations feel disproportionately charged, why feedback in specific domains stings in a way that feels bodily, Why the same criticism from two different people lands with different weight depending on their perceived rank relative to yours. The calculation is continuous. You're running it right now, even here, even alone, because the social brain does not fully power down in the absence of others. It rehearses. It runs simulations of past interactions, adjusts its models, prepares its strategies. The default mode network, active in rest, is heavily involved in social cognition. Alone, your brain is still, in some sense, in the room, still managing its position, still holding the role. What remains unclear, and the research is honest about this, which I appreciate, is how much the role can shift in adulthood. Status hierarchies in humans are less rigid than in other species. New contexts produce new hierarchies. A person with low perceived rank in one domain may occupy a completely different position in another, and the nervous system tracks these distinctions with surprising granularity. But the earliest assigned role leaves a residue, not a destiny, a starting weight, a baseline the system returns to under stress, under unfamiliarity, under any condition that strips away the accumulated evidence of competence and belonging and leaves the nervous system working from older data. Under pressure, the brain often reaches for what it learned first. The role it was given before it knew it was being given one. There is something in the throat that knows before you do. Not a feeling exactly, a configuration, a slight drawing together of tissue, a change in how air moves through on its way to becoming speech. You felt it. The moment before a difficult conversation, when the body has already begun its preparation, has already started the quiet work of managing what will and won't be allowed through. You hadn't just did anything yet. The decision had already been made somewhere lower, somewhere older than deciding. Emotional suppression, the effortful inhibition of expressive behavior while an emotion is actively occurring, is one of the more thoroughly studied forms of emotion regulation and one of the more costly. James Gross at Stanford spent years mapping its consequences, and what the data showed was not subtle. Suppression works in the narrow sense that it reduces the outward signal. The face stays composed, the voice stays even. The response that wanted to surface does not surface, but the physiological arousal that generated the response does not reduce. It stays. The body remains in the elevated state, heart rate up, cortisol present, sympathetic activation ongoing, while the face reports that everything is fine. The divergence between internal state and external expression is not resolved by suppression. It is sustained. The system stays mobilized with nowhere to discharge, like a room full of sound with the door closed. What's more, and this is the part that took longer to establish, the cognitive load of maintaining suppression is significant. Working memory capacity drops measurably during suppression tasks. Attention narrows. The prefrontal resources devoted to inhibiting the response are resources no longer available for thinking clearly, for tracking the conversation, for being genuinely present with whoever you're talking to. You've probably felt this as a kind of flatness, a slight dullness in a conversation where you were also underneath managing something. The two things running simultaneously, the performance of neutrality and the actual internal state, and neither getting your full attention. The jaw knows this too, the masseter muscle, which closes the mouth, which holds the face in its composed arrangement, carries tension that accumulates across the day in ways that don't always release at night. Bruxism, the grinding of teeth during sleep, is associated with elevated psychological stress, with the body continuing at night, the muscular holding it practiced all day. The suppression doesn't end when the situation ends. The tissue remembers the shape it was asked to hold. Then there is the sternum, the area around the chest, And this is not metaphor. This is where people actually locate the sensation, often holds what the face was instructed to conceal, a heaviness, a pressure that isn't quite pain. The vagus nerve running from brainstem through thorax and into the abdomen is continuously involved in the regulation of emotional state, and its activity during suppression is measurably different from its activity during what researchers call cognitive reappraisal, a different regulatory strategy, one that changes the meaning of the situation rather than the expression of the response to it. Reappraisal leaves the body quieter. Suppression leaves it holding. There is a finding from the social neuroscience literature that I've returned to more than once, not because it is the most dramatic finding in this area, but because it is one of the most quietly uncomfortable. People who suppress more frequently are perceived by their interaction partners as less warm, less affiliative, harder to connect with, even when the partners have no explicit knowledge that suppression is occurring. The body leaks what the face conceals, something in the micro-expression, in the timing of response, in the slight asynchrony between what is said and how the body accompanies what is said. Interaction partners detect it without being able to name it. They feel the distance. They just don't know where it came from. And in longer relationships, in the sustained proximity of people who share years together, the cumulative effect of what is regularly suppressed begins to shape the texture of the relationship itself, not through any single withheld response, through the accumulated weight of all of them, the conversation that never happened, the reaction that was managed rather than expressed, the version of the self that stayed behind the closed door while a quieter, more governable version went out to meet the day. What remains behind that door is not lost. The neural activity is still there, still present, still, in some sense, waiting. Emotion suppression does not resolve the underlying state. It postpones the expression of it. And the postponement has a biology. Elevated inflammatory markers over time in chronic suppressors, altered immune function, changes in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that accumulate across years of high-effort regulation. The body is not indifferent to what it is asked to carry quietly. It keeps a kind of record, not in memory, not in narrative, but in tissue, in baseline arousal levels, in the threshold at which the nervous system considers itself at rest versus merely paused. Chronic suppression raises that threshold. Rest becomes harder to reach because the system has learned to treat quietude as temporary, as a managed state rather than a genuine one, as something that requires maintenance rather than something that simply arrives. This is the cost that doesn't appear in a single moment. It appears across many ordinary days in the slight effort it takes to feel genuinely still, in the extra seconds before sleep finds you, in the vague sense, familiar perhaps, sitting with you in quiet moments like this one, that something is being held that would prefer to be set down. If only the right moment would arrive. If only the right conditions could be trusted. If only the body could be convinced that nothing further is required of it tonight. Nothing further is required of it tonight. The suppression that ran all day has no audience now. The face can stop its reporting. The jaw can find, if it remembers how, something looser than it held at 4 in the afternoon. The sternum can carry a little less than it carried in the car on the way home, in the meeting where you listened without responding, in the conversation where the thing you almost said stayed almost. What gets suppressed goes somewhere, and somewhere eventually it can be put down, not resolved, not erased, just no longer actively held. And the nervous system, given enough quiet and enough time without demand, will begin very slowly the long work of returning to itself. Before you have decided anything, something has already decided. Not a thought, a state, a shift in the baseline that your body was running a moment ago. something in the autonomic tone, in the way the muscles of the face have arranged themselves without instruction, in a change so small it has no aim in ordinary language, but that your nervous system recognized immediately, classified, and responded to before the responding even registered. You walked into the room, and something in the room walked into you first. The human nervous system is, at its core, a prediction machine with survival priorities. This is not a metaphor for something else. It is the actual organizing principle of how your brain allocates attention, generates expectation, and produces behavior. Every sensory input arriving at any moment is being compared constantly, automatically, without consultation, against a model of what was expected. When reality matches the model, the system continues. When it doesn't, something flags. That flagging is what you feel as unease, not yet fear, not yet a thought, just a change in state, a tightening somewhere in the chest cavity that precedes any sentence you might form about why. The amygdala and its role has been overstated in popular accounts and then partially walked back, which is how neuroscience often works, in corrections that are harder to share than the original finding, does respond to threat-relevant stimuli with extraordinary speed. The thalamo-amygdala pathway, sometimes called the low road, bypasses the cortex entirely. A signal comes in, the amygdala receives it, a response is initiated. The cortex learns about this afterward, sometimes milliseconds later, sometimes in the form of a feeling that seems to have arrived from nowhere. The feeling didn't arrive from nowhere. It arrived from somewhere older than the part of you that narrates your experience. What the nervous system reads in a room is not primarily visual, or not only visual. It reads the acoustic texture, the particular quality of silence, whether it is the silence of emptiness or the silence of held breath. It reads the movement patterns of bodies, their speed and direction, and the micro-hesitations that signal uncertainty or concealment. It reads, through mechanisms not yet fully mapped, something in the collective autonomic state of the people present. A room full of regulated nervous systems feels different, bodily different, from a room where several people are suppressing something. You know this. You've always known this in your body before you knew it anywhere else. Here is the part that is harder to sit with. This assessment, the one your nervous system produces in the first seconds of entering a space, the verdict about safety and threat and the social temperature of the room, substantially shapes everything that follows. The personality you deploy in that room, the version of yourself that comes forward or stays back. The threshold at which you speak, question, challenge, or go quiet. All of this is downstream of a reading you didn't consciously take. The conscious experience of the room, the opinions you form, the impressions you register, the story you tell yourself afterward about what the atmosphere was like, these feel primary. They feel like the actual assessment. They are, in the most literal neurological sense, secondary. They are the cortex arriving at a conclusion the body had already reached, finding reasons for a response that had already begun, building a narrative around a verdict that was delivered without deliberation. This happens every time, in every room, in every conversation, in the particular quality of pause between two sentences, when something shifts and you feel it, physically, before you understand it. The polyvagal framework, Stephen Porges's account of how the autonomic nervous system mediates social engagement, describes a process called neuroception, the continuous subconscious detection of safety and threat cues in the environment. Not perception, because perception implies awareness. Neuroception runs below awareness. It is the nervous system reading the room in the dark without turning on the lights, using sensors that have been calibrated across a lifetime of relational experience. What it finds, it acts on. What you feel afterward is the downstream consequence of that action. The emotional state, the posture, the sudden inexplicable desire to leave or stay, the opening or closing that happens in the chest before the mind has finished its sentence. There is something worth noticing quietly about what this means for the self. If the version of you that shows up in any given room is partly determined by what your nervous system read before you arrived at conscious awareness, then the self that you experience as choosing, as responding, as being a particular kind of person in a particular kind of space is always, to some degree, already in motion before it feels like it has begun. Not controlled, not determined, just already started. The room is quiet now. Whatever your nervous system read when you settled into this, the specific acoustic texture of wherever you are, the temperature of the air, the presence or absence of other bodies nearby, it has already rendered its verdict, filed its report, adjusted your baseline accordingly. You're already responding to it. You have been this whole time. It happens so gradually that you don't notice it happening. The first few times you are with someone, in the particular biological sense of being with them, your nervous system in proximity to theirs, your autonomic state in quiet negotiation with their autonomic state, something in you is working, not visibly, not effortfully, in the way that conscious performance is effortful, but working nonetheless. The social monitoring circuits are running at higher output. The prefrontal cortex is allocating more resources to behavioral management. A faint vigilance saturates the interaction, the kind that has nothing to do with disliking the person, and everything to do with the nervous system not yet having enough data to reduce its surveillance. This is not distrust. It is the biology of the unfamiliar, doing what it was built to do. Over time, and the timeline varies enormously between people, between nervous systems, between the particular relational histories each person carries into proximity with another, something begins to change, not dramatically, not in a single conversation or a single moment of shared honesty, though those can accelerate it. More like a slow structural shift, the kind you only notice in retrospect. The held thing begins almost imperceptibly to release. Heart rate variability, the beat-to-beat variation in cardiac rhythm that serves as one of the cleaner markers of autonomic regulation, tends to be higher in the presence of people the nervous system has categorized as safe. Higher variability reflects greater vagal influence on the heart, a parasympathetic signature, the body's indication that it is not bracing. The research is consistent enough on this that some researchers have used HRV as a proxy for felt safety in social contexts, watching it shift in real time as interaction partners move from strangers to something else. The body marks the transition before the mind names it. What emerges in the space that opens when surveillance reduces is not always what people expect. The common account of intimacy is that it reveals a truer, warmer, more generous self, the authentic person finally allowed to surface. And there is something in this, but the neuroscience is more complicated, and I think more interesting than the simple authenticity narrative allows. What disinhibition releases is not curated. It releases the unmanaged, which includes warmth, yes, but also irritability, impatience. The particular humour that only comes out when someone has stopped monitoring it. The opinions held back in more surveilled company. The grief that has nowhere to go in rooms where composure is required. The silliness. The obsessive returning to the same topic. The body that stops holding its stomach in, that takes up more of the couch, that makes sounds it would suppress in unfamiliar company. None of this is truer exactly than the managed version. It is less supervised, which is different. The prefrontal cortex, which handles so much of what we call social behavior, the inhibition of responses, the selection of contextually appropriate outputs, the continuous editing of self-presentation is metabolically expensive to run at high output. Familiarity reduces the demand. The system can afford to idle in certain regions. And what runs in the absence of that active management is something closer to the nervous system's default, not the self in its most essential form, but the self without its professional layer, without the layer calibrated for unfamiliar company, without the particular vigilance that proximity to an unread nervous system demands. You know this version of someone when you have seen it. The particular way a person moves through their own kitchen, the register their voice drops to when they've stopped performing ease and are actually at ease, the face they make before they've assembled the face they're going to make. These are not more real than the public versions, but they carry information the public versions don't, about baseline effect, about what the nervous system looks like when it isn't dressing for an audience. Across years, this loosening compounds. A nervous system that has spent hundreds of hours in proximity to another has built a detailed predictive model of that person, their emotional rhythms, their signals of stress and comfort, the specific way their body changes before they say something difficult. This model runs continuously in their presence, and its accuracy reduces the cognitive load of the interaction. Less processing required, less uncertainty to manage. The system can afford to be less defended because it has enough data to feel, at some cellular level, prepared. This is, I think, one of the quieter gifts of long familiarity, not the grand gestures, not the shared history in its narrative form, but the reduction in metabolic cost. The nervous system in the presence of someone it knows deeply is doing less work, and in that reduced work, something that was always there but rarely gets the resources has room to move. What moves is different for everyone. Some people become funnier, some become quieter in a way that is fuller than their public quiet. Some become more physically demonstrative, the touch that was restrained in less familiar company, finding its way back to a shoulder, an arm. Some become more honest about fear, about uncertainty, about the things they have been carrying in the more surveilled hours of their days. The biological loosening doesn't produce a new person, it produces the person who was there, all along, with a little less weight on top. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes in the particular quality of an ordinary evening with someone the nervous system has fully admitted. The heart rate slows without being asked to. The jaw finds a resting place it doesn't reach in other company. The breath drops lower in the chest, not because anything has been resolved, just because the body finally has run out of reasons to brace. Something is passing between you and whoever is near you. Not a thought, not a word, something older than both, a continuous bidirectional exchange of biological information that your nervous system is conducting right now, has been conducting since before you were aware there was a self to conduct it from. The exchange has no pause button, no opt-out. It runs in the background of every proximity, every shared room, every moment of sitting near another body while something else seems to be happening in the foreground. The foreground is rarely where the significant thing is occurring. Respiratory entrainment, the tendency of two people in close proximity to synchronize their breathing patterns over time, has been documented across a range of contexts, from therapeutic relationships to musical performance to the simple shared experience of sitting quietly together. The synchronization is not deliberate. It does not require awareness. It requires only proximity and time, and it produces in both nervous systems a measurable shift in autonomic state. Breathing together, even without knowing it, changes what the body is doing. This is not the most intimate thing that passes between people. It is simply the most visible. Cardiac couplings, as the subtler stranger finding that heart rate patterns between people begin to correlate during sustained interaction, has been documented in therapist-client pairs, in romantic partners, in parent-infant dyads where the infant's cardiac rhythm gradually entrains to the caregivers over the first months of life. The heart, which takes its rhythmic instructions from the autonomic nervous system, is not an isolated organ running its own private clock. It is listening. It is, in whatever sense we can apply that word to tissue, responsive. Your heart rate has been influenced today by whoever you spent time near, probably more than once. The polyvagal theory and its empirical status is still being worked out, which is worth saying plainly, offers a framework in which the social engagement system, mediated by the myelinated vagus nerve, is understood as the primary biological interface between one nervous system and another. The prosody of a voice, the micro-expressions that cross a face in the fractions of a second between intention and expression, the quality of eye contact, its duration and steadiness, the particular kind of attention it carries or withholds. All of these are inputs to your autonomic system, continuously processed, continuously shaping the state your body is maintaining. A calm nervous system beside yours does something measurable to yours, not through instruction, not through intention, through the signals your social engagement system is reading without your awareness. The slower prosody, the lower vocal register, the steadier respiration, the face whose muscles are not bracing, and translating through pathways running below conscious access into a shift in your own autonomic tone. The parasympathetic influence increases. The heart finds a slightly different rhythm. The breath drops without being told to. You did not decide to be regulated by them. Your nervous system decided, in the currency it uses, which has no words. The reverse is equally true and somewhat harder to think about. Your nervous system is doing this to other people. The state you carry into a room, the cortisol load from the afternoon, the unresolved muscular tension from a conversation that didn't finish cleanly, the quality of attention you bring, scattered or present or somewhere performing presence while actually somewhere else. This becomes part of the biological environment of whoever is near you. They are reading it. Their autonomic systems are processing it. Their heart rate and respiratory pattern and cortisol profile are being influenced by yours, without either of you exchanging a word about any of it. This is not a responsibility meant to produce anxiety. It is just the actual condition of being a mammal with a social nervous system in proximity to other mammals with social nervous systems. It has always been this way. The capacity for co-regulation, for two nervous systems to influence each other's state through proximity and signal, is older than language, older than the cortex that now narrates experience. It is written into the autonomic architecture of every mammal that has ever huddled with its own kind against cold or threat or the particular darkness that social isolation produces in a body built for contact. Mammals raised in isolation show measurably different autonomic profiles from those raised with consistent co-regulatory contact. The nervous system, deprived of the regulatory input that proximity provides, develops differently. Not just psychologically, structurally, in the vagal pathways, in the HPA axis, in the baseline around which arousal organizes itself. The other nervous system is not optional equipment. It is part of the developmental environment, part of what builds the regulatory capacity the adult nervous system then carries through the world. You were built in part by proximity, by the specific nervous systems that were near yours in the years when yours was still learning what its baseline should be. Their respiratory patterns, their cardiac rhythms, their cortisol profiles, their quality of presence or absence. All of this was data your developing nervous system used to calibrate itself. to set its thresholds, to determine what the range of normal felt like, what safety felt like in the body, what to expect from the proximity of others. That calibration persists. It is not destiny, but it is history, written in the body's default settings rather than in memory, shaping the baseline from which every subsequent coregulatory exchange begins. And tonight, in whatever proximity you are in right now, near another body or alone with the particular quality of aloneness that is itself a kind of input to the nervous system, something is still passing. The room's acoustics, the temperature against skin. If someone is near you, their breathing. If no one is near you, the absence of respiratory sound, which the social nervous system registers as its own kind of information. You are right now being shaped by what is around you, faintly, continuously, without asking to be. This is not a problem to solve. It is not a vulnerability to correct. It is the actual mechanism by which nervous systems maintain themselves in a social world by remaining always slightly open to what is near, slightly permeable, slightly responsive to the biological signals that other bodies send without knowing they are sending them. The boundary between your nervous system and the one beside you is real. It is also, in ways that matter, thinner than it appears. Nobody is watching, and something almost imperceptibly shifts, not a dramatic change, not the removal of a mask in the theatrical sense, because that image implies there was always something false being worn, and the biology is more complicated than that. But something in the muscular arrangement of the face softens. The zygomaticus, which pulls the corner of the mouth, finds a resting position it doesn't reach in company. The orbicularis oculi, the muscle around the eye that activates in genuine expressions, stops its subtle management. The face, unobserved, becomes less organized. This is not the face relaxing, this is the face stopping its work. The social brain, and this network of regions, the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporoparietal junction, the posterior superior temporal sulcus, runs nearly continuously in humans because humans are nearly continuously into the presence of or anticipating the presence of others, does not power down completely when aloneness arrives, but its output changes, the monitoring reduces, the continuous modelling of how one is being perceived, the quiet background process of tracking one's own appearance from the imagined outside softens its signal. What is left is quieter. Researchers studying self-conscious emotions, shame, pride, embarrassment, the entire register of feelings that require an imagined audience to function, have found that these states depend on a specific neural operation, the ability to take the perspective of another person and view the self through that perspective. This operation, which happens so automatically in social life that it feels like ordinary self-awareness, requires activation of the mentalizing network. When aloneness is genuine, when the social monitoring system is truly idling rather than rehearsing, this activation reduces. The self stops being watched, even by itself. What remains is harder to describe. Not because it is mysterious, the biology is straightforward enough, but because the thing that would normally describe it is the same thing that has temporarily gone quiet. The narrating self, the one that produces the ongoing internal account of who you are and what you are doing and how you're coming across, requires some of the same neural resources as social monitoring. In genuine solitude, it too softens. There are expressions that cross the face when no one is watching that don't have names. Not because they are complex, because they are never witnessed long enough to be categorized. The face, unobserved, moves through configurations that social life never holds still. Transitional states, the micro-expressions between expressions, the resting positions that exist only in the gaps between performed ones. These are real. They involve the same musculature, the same motor neurons, the same facial action units that researchers use to classify emotion. They are just never seen. The body moves differently alone, not always more freely, sometimes more strangely with less coherence, without the organizing influence that another person's presence provides. The gait changes. The posture finds positions that would be edited in company. The hands do things the hands don't do when they know they might be noticed. None of this is hidden. It is just unwitnessed. There is a finding in the self-perception literature that has stayed with me, not because it is surprising, but because it states something plainly that usually goes unstated. People's self-reports of their own personality traits are less accurate predictors of their behavior than the reports of people who know them well. The self, it turns out, is not the most reliable narrator of its own character. The version of yourself that exists in your own account is constructed, assembled from memory, from social feedback, from the ongoing internal narration, and it contains gaps that other observers, paradoxically, can sometimes see more clearly. Which raises a question the neuroscience cannot quite answer. The version of you that exists when no one is watching, less composed, less coherent, less organized by the presence of another nervous system, is it more accurate, or is it simply less edited? I don't think the data resolves this. The brain's default mode network, most active during rest and self-referential thought, produces something when aloneness arrives, a quality of inner life that feels, from the inside, more genuinely personal than the social performances that bracket it. But this feeling of authenticity may itself be a construction. The default mode network is not a window onto the true self. It is another mode of processing, another configuration of the same neural hardware. There may be no configuration that counts as the original. What there is, tonight, is this: a body in a quiet room, a face doing less than it does in daylight, a nervous system running its programs at reduced social output, monitoring less, performing less, holding less of the muscular tension that the presence of others, even loved others, even welcomed others, inevitably produces. This version of you has no audience. It never has. And in that unwitnessed quality, not despite it, but in it, there is something that is entirely, if briefly, just yours. Something persists. Through the role assignments and the mimicry and the autonomic negotiations and the long accumulated weight of suppression and the loosening that familiarity eventually produces, through all of it, across all the versions of you that different rooms and different people have called forward, something holds its shape, not rigidly, not in a way that announces itself, but measurably, consistently, in the way that certain biological patterns hold across time, regardless of the conditions layered over them. The research on temperament, the dispositional qualities present in infancy and early childhood that predict, with imperfect but genuine reliability, aspects of personality decades later, suggests that the nervous system arrives at the world already inclined, already tilted in certain directions. Some infants startle more readily than others. Some orient toward novelty, some orient away. Some regulate quickly after distress. Some take longer, require more, carry the arousal further into the next experience. These early inclinations are not destiny, but they are not nothing. Jerome Kagan spent decades following children who'd been classified in infancy as behaviorally inhibited, those who withdrew from the unfamiliar, whose physiological responses to novelty were consistently more pronounced, and found that while many of these children grew into adults who had learned to manage the inhibition, to overlay it with acquired ease, the underlying physiological signature remained detectable. The heart rate still climbed a little faster in uncertain situations. The amygdala still responded with slightly more amplitude to ambiguous social signals. The pattern persisted beneath the adaptation, not as limitation, just as the terrain beneath the building. What temperament actually is, at the biological level, is still being worked out. The leading accounts involve differences in the reactivity of certain neural circuits, the amygdala and its connections to prefrontal regulatory regions, the HPA axis, and its calibration during early development, the dopaminergic pathways governing approach motivation, and the serotonergic systems involved in threat sensitivity. These are not fixed structures. They are weighted tendencies. Systems that have been set through genetic influence and early environmental input to respond at certain thresholds rather than others. The weights can shift. Experience moves them. Sustained experience moves them more. A nervous system that spent years in high-threat environments has had its threat detection threshold calibrated accordingly. A nervous system that found consistent safety in early relationships has a different baseline from which it meets the world. The temperament is not unaffected by experience. It is the starting point that experience then modifies, but it remains the starting point. And here, this is the part I find genuinely difficult to hold without reaching for a conclusion that isn't quite supported. The starting point leaves something in the biological record that decades of modification don't fully erase. Not because the nervous system is rigid, but because the patterns laid down earliest are the ones most deeply integrated into the regulatory architecture that everything subsequent is built on top of. Think of it less as a fixed thing and more as a watermark. Visible when you hold the paper up to light, not the whole document, not even the most important part, but there consistently, regardless of what has been written over it. Longitudinal studies tracking personality across the lifespan, Roberts and Rochek's work on personality development, the decades-long data sets from the Berkeley studies, the NIH-funded cohort research following individuals from childhood into their 70s, show something that is both reassuring and strange. Personality becomes more stable with age, not less. The variability that characterizes younger nervous systems gradually reduces. The person becomes over time more consistently themselves across contexts, not more rigid, more settled. The contexts still shape the expression. A 70-year-old nervous system still reads the room, still activates differently in different social environments, still carries the legacy of its attachment history into new proximity. But the range of variation narrows. The return to baseline quickens. Whatever the central tendency of that particular nervous system is, it asserts itself more efficiently as the decades accumulate. There is something in this that resists the easy interpretation. It would be comforting to read it as the true self finally winning, the essential person emerging from beneath all the social performance and adaptive layering. But I don't think the data supports that framing. What settles is not a truth. It is a pattern, a biological signature that has been running long enough to become efficient, to have worn its channels deep enough that the system returns to them without effort. The signature is real. It is yours. It is not, in any philosophically meaningful sense, more you than the versions that shift and adapt and mirror and suppress. It is simply the one that persists. And persistence in biology carries its own kind of weight. Not moral weight, not the weight of authenticity, but the weight of a system that has been running long enough to become reliable, predictable to itself, recognizable on a cellular level as the particular nervous system it has always been. You've been this nervous system your whole life. Every version of you, the one that arrived in rooms already adjusted, the one that borrowed other people's rhythms, the one that held things in the jaw and the sternum, the one that loosened in familiar company, the one that existed unwitnessed in quiet rooms, every version ran on this same underlying hardware, this same set of weighted tendencies, this same biological starting point that no amount of adaptation has fully overwritten. The shifting was real. The thing beneath the shifting was also real. Both things are true simultaneously, and the nervous system has never required you to choose between them. It ran both. It has always run both. The responsive surface and the persistent depth, the versions called forward by other people and the signature that underlies all of them, quiet and consistent and recognizable, if you stay still long enough as something that has been here all along. You are still here. The same nervous system that began this, a little more worn perhaps, a little more familiar with its own patterns, but running the same deep program it has always run, beneath everything that changed, beneath everything that adapted, beneath every room you entered and every version of yourself you assembled for it. Still going, still in its own biological way yours. There was no moment when it changed. That's the thing that's hardest to locate afterward, the before. You look back and you can identify the person you were several years ago, can feel the difference between that nervous system and this one, can notice that certain thresholds have shifted, certain reflexes have softened or sharpened, certain things that used to require effort now arrive without it. But the moment of change isn't there, not because it was hidden, because it didn't exist as a moment. It existed as accumulation. Neuroplasticity is the word used for this, though the word has been so thoroughly recruited by self-improvement culture that it now carries associations the biology doesn't quite support. The sense that change is always intentional, always effortful, always moving in a chosen direction. The actual science is less tidy and I think more interesting. The nervous system changes in response to what it repeatedly experiences, regardless of whether those experiences were selected, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention to the fact that change was occurring. Synaptic strength shifts with use. Cortical representations expand or contract depending on what is practiced or neglected. The HPA axis recalibrates around whatever stress profile the environment has been consistently providing. None of this requires intention. None of it sends a notification. It just happens, was happening, has been happening this entire time. The people involved in this are not always the ones you would name if asked who shaped you. Not always the dramatic relationships, the significant losses, the obvious influences. Often, more often than the dramatic account of personal development allows for, the shaping was done by proximity, by the specific nervous systems you spent ordinary time near. The colleague across the office for 3 years, the friend whose house you ate dinner in every Thursday for a decade, the partner whose morning rhythms became the rhythms your own body organized itself around without deciding to. Their emotional patterns became part of your baseline, not through any single conversation, not through influence in the conscious sense, but through the slow, biological fact of co-regulation repeated across hundreds of unremarkable afternoons. Their cortisol profiles, their default levels of arousal, their thresholds for what counted as threat or ease, these entered your nervous system through proximity the way sediment enters water. Continuously, invisibly, without drama, until one day the composition is different from what it was before. The Tuesday afternoons did this. Not the arguments, not the revelations, not the moments that get remembered and retold. The Tuesdays, the commutes, the particular quality of silence over breakfast repeated across seasons until the nervous system learned to expect it, calibrated around it, incorporated it into its model of what ordinary felt like. This is neuroplasticity operating at its actual scale, not the scale of the dramatic intervention or the deliberate practice session, but the scale of lived duration, of years, of the slow geological pressure of repeated experience on tissue that was built to respond to exactly that. What gets changed specifically is harder to isolate than the popular account suggests. Emotional reactivity thresholds shift. A person who spent years in close proximity to someone with high baseline anxiety may find, long after that proximity has ended, that their own startle response is calibrated slightly higher than it might otherwise have been. A person who shared years with someone whose nervous system found ease readily may carry a lower resting cortisol level than their early temperament alone would have predicted. These are not dramatic transformations, they are adjustments. Biological adjustments, measurable in principle, invisible in daily life, only apparent when you hold two time points far enough apart to see the distance between them. And then there are the cognitive patterns, the way certain people reshape the categories through which you perceive social situations, not by telling you how to think, but by modelling repeatedly a particular way of responding to ambiguity or conflict or intimacy, till that pattern becomes familiar enough that your own nervous system begins running something like it without being asked. The borrowed humour that no longer feels borrowed. The particular way of pausing before responding that came from someone else's nervous system and is now yours. The threshold for what counts as too loud, too close, too much, calibrated across years of shared space with a specific other person's sensory preferences. You did not choose most of this. A drift occurred, was occurring continuously in the background of what felt like ordinary life. The choosing happened at the larger scale, who to be near, how long to stay. But the biological reshaping happened at a scale below choice, in the synaptic weights and hormonal baselines and regulatory thresholds that were quietly adjusting to the environment those choices created. There is something both uncomfortable and relieving about this, depending on the moment in which you encounter it. Uncomfortable because it means the people you spent time near have left biological traces that didn't require your permission. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between influence you welcomed and influence that simply accumulated through duration. It responds to what it repeatedly experienced. Full stop. Relieving because it means the same process is continuing now. Whatever proximity you are currently in, whatever recurring nervous systems your own is spending ordinary Tuesday time near, is part of the ongoing calibration. The drift doesn't stop, the plasticity doesn't close. The nervous system remains, across the entire lifespan, responsive to sustained experience in ways that allow for genuine change, not overnight, not through single dramatic encounters, but through the slow geological pressure of repeated ordinary moments. You are being shaped right now, not dramatically, not visibly, in the way that everything biological happens when it is working correctly, quietly, continuously below the threshold of daily awareness in the unremarkable texture of a life being lived near other lives. The person you will be in 10 years is being assembled in the Tuesday afternoons, in the recurring dinners, in the commutes shared or solitary, in the particular quality of silence you are living inside most often, and what that silence is teaching your nervous system to expect from the world. It has always been the ordinary moments. It was always going to be. The performance has no audience now. Whatever the day required, the calibrations, the monitored expressions, the versions of yourself assembled for specific rooms and specific people, none of it's required anymore. The social engagement system is still running, because it always is, because a nervous system built across millions of years of social mammalian life does not simply switch off when the room empties, but its output has dropped. The monitoring has reduced to something closer to a murmur. The face has stopped organizing itself. There is a region of the prefrontal cortex, the ventromedial portion, involved in self-referential processing and the regulation of social behavior, whose metabolic activity measurably decreases during the transition towards sleep. The neural cost of being a social self, of maintaining the ongoing project of personhood in relation to others, begins to reduce. Not because the self disappears, because the maintenance becomes, for a few hours, unnecessary. This is one of the less discussed functions of sleep. Not just memory consolidation, not just cellular repair, not just the glymphatic clearing of metabolic waste from the brain's interstitial space. Though all of that is happening, has already begun happening, is happening right now in the slow increase of interstitial space between your neurons as the glymphatic system opens its channels and begins its nightly passage. Beyond all of that, sleep is when the social self is allowed to stop its work. When the version of you that exists in relation to others is permitted, temporarily, to go offline. The default mode network, which has been running social simulations all day, modelling other people, rehearsing conversations, constructing and revising the ongoing narrative of the self, begins to shift its activity as sleep approaches. Its outputs become less coherent. The simulations lose their social specificity. The narrative fragments. The internal account of who you are and how you're doing, and what tomorrow requires, begins to lose its hold. This is not failure. This is the system working correctly. The autonomic nervous system has been moving toward parasympathetic dominance for some time now. Heart rate has been dropping. Respiratory amplitude deepening slightly, slowing, finding a rhythm that requires less effort than the rhythms of the day. Core body temperature has been declining since the early evening, a circadian process that signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, to the pineal gland releasing melatonin into the bloodstream, that the biological night has arrived. Your body has been preparing for this longer than you knew. The muscles in the jaw, which always hold, are finding something looser now, not fully. Some tension persists even into sleep, carried there by the nervous system that doesn't always receive the message that the holding is no longer required. But less than before, less than this afternoon, less than the conversation that ran too long or the silence that asked too much. Something is setting down, the social circuits still murmur. They will run something even in sleep, faces appear in dreams, voices, the social architecture of imagined rooms. The brain does not stop being a social brain, but the urgency is gone from it. The stakes for now have been removed. Whatever rank was being maintained, whatever impression managed, whatever version of the self kept carefully assembled throughout the day, the biology is releasing its grip on all of it, not resolving it, just releasing. The chapters that came before this one, the nervous system reading rooms, the attachment residue in the shoulders, the mimicry running beneath awareness, the long slow drift of ordinary Tuesdays, none of it is gone, it is all still there, written in the tissue, in the baseline thresholds, in the weighted synaptic patterns that make you specifically you and not anyone else. But right now it is quiet. The breathing has slowed. Probably you noticed this before this sentence named it. The thing that remains underneath the social self and the performed self and the suppressed self and the unwitnessed self is just the body doing what bodies do when finally left alone to do it. Metabolizing, regulating, running the ancient programs that have nothing to do with other people and everything to do with simple biological continuance, heart moving, lungs finding the next breath without being asked. The nervous system, yours specifically, with its particular history and its weighted tendencies and its long accumulated record of every room it ever entered, settling into the lowest output it will reach tonight, still running, just quietly, the social brain idles, the jaw, softer now, the breath, already somewhere else.